One elder I interviewed, Elder Rose Bird from Thunderchild First Nation. She's one of our elders here at First Nations University up in Prince Albert. She explained how that colonial legislation and structures that were in place, how it controlled, she felt controlled and that they were in place to control Indigenous people and create a system of dependency that really denied many access to money and an education in money management, not being able to actually control their own finances in many cases on reserve, right? Having to go through the Indian agent to, access food and to be able to even go off reserve, right? When the pass system was in place, there was a complete dependency and lack of access to money and controlling their own financial state.
This is the Personal Finance Show.
Hi, I'm Bo Humphreys, and this is the Personal Finance Show. Bettina Schneider wants you to understand the impact your values, histories, and life experiences have on your financial decision-making processes. Bettina has a PhD in Native American Studies and is currently Associate Professor and Associate Vice President Academic at First Nations University of Canada. Bettina spends a lot of her time contemplating the following questions. How can we increase Indigenous people's access to culturally relevant financial education resources? And how can we frame the way we talk about financial literacy and personal finance in order to make it more accessible to a wider audience? Bettina believes that financial literacy resources do not always speak to the varied values and experiences of their audience, and would like to see more of those resources explore how people's money culture impacts the way they relate to money. Bettina joined me from Regina, Saskatchewan, to share her personal finance story.
I think one of my earliest positive memories as a kid was my first job at a little cider mill in New York, right in the town where I grew up. And I was probably about 14, and I was just thrilled by that, right? The idea that I could start working and earning my own money and be a bit independent. And I think it tied into some more challenging memories early on from my childhood, because it was right around that time that my dad had lost his job, probably a few years beforehand. He'd been working as part of a family business. The family business went under, and everything started to crumble a bit. Although, to be honest, we didn't talk about it. I didn't know fully the scope of what was happening in my family. My parents, they wanted to protect us from what was happening. What they started to do was dip into savings in a big way and take on debt to manage life. And it wasn't sustainable. And I think that there was a clear sense that something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what was happening. They tried to find work in a number of different areas, but nothing was really working very well for a long time. And so the more I could be independent, the better, right?
Like so you wouldn't have to, ask them for money for certain things? I
just didn't want to be a burden, because I could sense they had enough on their plate at that time. And so, there was, I think, some sense just to be independent, try to find my own way financially. But at the same time, being in an environment where we didn't really talk about money and what was happening, it did impact me, not for the better, right? And I don't think we really, as a family, talked about financial literacy, personal finance in any way that maybe helped prepare us, as me and my brothers, going forward. And I think my parents, my dad and his family, I don't think that he grew up in an environment, right, where money was discussed, and these kind of critical lessons that you learn through personal finance, they weren't part of his childhood growing up. I think my mom was exposed to it a bit more. She grew up in a bit more of a working class family, and my dad had, I think, less money worries growing up early on, and they just, I don't think, had a very strong base themselves as kids in terms of how do you go about managing money well at an early age. There were criticisms my dad had even of money at an early age because of some of the stuff he saw going on around him and his family and his world.
His relationship with money wasn't very healthy, enough that he was criticizing the way that the system worked.
Exactly. He was him and my mom were coming of age in the 60s, 70s. They were part of a very much a counterculture. Yeah. Worldview. My dad, had grown up in a family where, I think in a world where he saw money as a very destructive force in many respects. It led to unhealthy relationships, greed, things that he was very philosophically critical of. And so I think his relationship with money was very shaped by that early childhood, that kind of counterculture mentality. He certainly, wanted to share what he had always, didn't want money to weigh him down, I think, in the way he saw it weighing others down in his life. And I think that certainly some of that got passed on to me in many ways at an early age. But that desire to, be generous, to give, to not be too attached to money. I think for him, he saw people so consumed with money around him that they didn't care for each other.
To avoid that, he needs to go to the other extreme, to jump ahead, knowing what you know now, having been through your life, and perhaps you have reconciled this. Is there a way to reconcile these two beliefs, that money is evil, but money can help us as well?
I definitely believe there is a way to reconcile it, and I certainly have struggled with that topic for quite some time. Right, that idea that how do you change the conversation around with those who see money as an evil, right? Who see money as there's a stigma around money and savings, and I deal with it all the time. In this course that I teach at the university, financial empowerment, even in some of the work and the research I've done regarding personal finance, it's a topic that's come up a lot, in my work with First Nations communities. There's been a lot of, conversations around just that idea, right? Money has been the root cause of many problems for Indigenous peoples across the world, right? It's stated in the text. The pursuit of money, right, has, fueled much of the conquest that colonized Indigenous peoples in Canada and throughout the world. And so there's often a stigma I've found in conversations, I've had in different research projects I've done. And so how do we turn that around and look at how can money be a source of, how can money help you align with those values that are important to you as an individual and as a community, as a collective? One of the questions I ask my students in the class a lot is how I've noticed that my students, a number of them, right, that focus on community is critical, right? That focus on giving back to their community and to their close relations and family, right? And it's something that I think we many of us relate to, but certainly I've seen it come up in so many conversations with my students and some of the research I've done with First Nations communities. And so how do we look at money as a way to, how can saving money help you to further the goals of your community? How can money, putting that money away, instead of looking at it as a negative and as an evil and as as you're hoarding money, look at it as a way to help those around you, help your community move forward, help you, achieve those dreams that your relatives and friends have. So we try to look at it and frame it in that way.
Yeah, I like that, because I can see how if you do have that original thought that money is evil and the money is what enabled the conquests of communities and civilizations in the past and still today, anything to do with money will seem like you're being selfish and you don't care if you don't do it, and if you don't incorporate that all into it, right? You're like, I don't want to be like those people who just use money for their own selfish reasons, selfish purposes.
Exactly.
So you're working on you're doing this a lot. You're working on reframing this. So let's go back then to you. You're 14 and you're earning money. What? So is this for you to just be able to enjoy your life, or are you actually having to contribute this back into the family?
Well, my parents never asked that of us at all at the time. But certainly, I would try to avoid asking for much, right? Of anything, I was never I think I was a bit of a frugal kid in general from the get go, and I think at that time I just wanted to have money to be able to have a cushion, something to be able to do things with friends, or just to save, to put away, really, and not have to rely or burden my parents in that way, and. My dad was always like, "Oh, here's $20, here's $10, because that's the kind of guy he was." And my mom, was that way too. They were both always very generous, beyond what they maybe should have been, right?
Sure, yeah, to their own detriment at times.
Absolutely. So I think for me, I was putting it away, and really, I didn't have clear goals outlined at the time, but just to kind of manage day-to-day things that would come up, and I wish, I was kind of more clear about my goals at the time, and had been, and I put some away for the future. But what that future was, it wasn't entirely clear. I had hoped to go to college, right, and university, but nothing I was earning could really, I think, deal with that decision to go to university and the debt that came with that.
No, yeah, the fact that you're even thinking about this in the early teens, some people never have to think about it at all until they get into, say past university, because the thing doesn't happen, the catalyst, the business going south, for example, because it sounds like you came from a relative position of privilege.
Yes,
is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So like, unless you start like, if you're actually poor, the idea of money being security doesn't usually come to be in someone who's coming from privilege, because it's just there. But because you had this incident, it seems like you then did adopt, like, I want my own independence and security. But you just didn't have a clear vision, of course, because you're a kid, right?
Right. Right.
So nobody expects you to have that. Did you have savings, like always? Was that something that you then, like, I want to have money so that, always, so that I don't run into this situation again?
I think that I always wanted to have some savings set aside, some cushion. I think that was always a strong drive within me. Certainly when I went to school, I wanted to always work, always had a side job, something happening, right, to ensure that, there was something coming in. When I went to university, the only way I was able to go, right, was because of student loans.
Just to interrupt you there, so your parents now are just trying to get by, and did they, like, I don't know if you don't have to get into the details, especially if it's private for them, but did they have to go bankrupt?
No, they didn't have to go bankrupt, but certainly, they had to end up selling the home and, essentially uprooting everything in their lives. And there was a lot of turmoil there once they did have to finally make that decision.
There was no money for you to go to school. So you knew student loans were the only way. And you're in New York State at this point still?
Yes, New York State.
And so what school did you end up going to?
Well, and this is where, again, more discussions around financial literacy might have led me to a different decision, but I had gone to NYU, which is not a cheap school to go to.
No.
And at the time, I think there were a lot of pressures around me in where I grew up. You got to go to university. You gotta go to school, and you gotta try to go to the best school you can go to. And I'd applied to some different options. My dad at one point did say, "Hey, do you want to stay here and commute?" And I could have tried to do it, certainly. And looking back, I maybe wish I had decided differently. But for various reasons, I at that point I wanted to be on my own and start my my life away from my home base. And so I decided to go to NYU, take on all that debt. My parents helped; they took on some of it, and I'm now helping right now to clear that debt on their end. And I've cleared the debt that I took on, and I'm dealing with the debt that they took on to help out, because they knew it was so important for me at the time to go to university. They never discouraged me otherwise to go. They always supported the decision. But where that money was to come from, right? There was no, it was, we had this magical world of student loans, and no one talked about the long-term impact of that, right? Let's look at what that's going to mean for you in 20 years, Bettina, or to them, even.
Yeah. So what year is this, just for context?
Mm-hmm. It was just 1997.
So yeah, you're probably 18 or something like that. So, and then what was the number once you were done university? What was the amount of the loans? Astronomical.
I mean, I graduated within a 3-year time frame because of the concern around the debt that was building up. I have a good friend of mine, my old roommate in college. She was doing the same thing, so I just followed her good lead. She said, "I'm getting out of here in 3 years because I don't want to have this excessive debt." So I was very fortunate that she kind of shared her vision, and I went that route as well. After it was all said and done, I'd have to go back to get the exact number, well over 60,000 at least. And a lot of my debt got tied up. When I went to grad school, I had some debt, very minimal compared to what I took on for undergrad. So that kind of got tied in with some of my other undergrad debt. So when it's all said and done, I'll probably be well over $70,000 in terms of the debt I'll have paid off.
And so you've taken care of your portion of that, but you're saying that your parents are still holding on to some?
They are, but I've absolutely, agreed that I'm covering every portion of my debt because I don't want to have that burden.
But it's taking it would be 2000 then when you graduated. So we're talking almost 20 years and the debt is still in existence.
Yeah.
And we'll find out why, because we're going to find out your trajectory. But so let's find out what you actually took in university and undergrad first. Yeah,
I was a history major. Loved history. Got really into immigration history in particular right at the time in New York. And then I went on, graduated, and couldn't find work.
Well, what would you have wanted to do? Did you have anything in mind at that point?
I didn't have a clear sense of where I was going. I knew I had wanted to, I wanted to do something that was, really contributing to making the world a better place, right? That was about where I was at that time. And so I was looking at the time for nonprofit jobs, but was realizing, if I was going to stay in New York, all the jobs that I was seeking out or even eligible for, I would be making hardly anything to cover the rent and expenses there. Even, to moving back home and commuting wasn't even feasible. So my mom said, "Hey, why don't you think about maybe going back to school? And maybe that's a route to go." And I found a program out in California in community development. I was very interested in that because I think from an early age too, I had one of my key life goals was to be part of a community in a way, to contribute to community in a way. My grandparents died in a car accident when I was 13, and I remember just being at their funeral and they were such a big part of the community, and it just impacted me in such a significant way that I think that really kind of shaped some of my direction, right? And where I wanted to kind of go with my life. And it's a very large, broad goal, right? But
any kind of community. But so this program was about how to improve community, or even build better community. Exactly.
And different ways that, that essentially we as individuals can contribute to that in society. And so there was there were a number of different routes you could go. But when, I went out there and just started taking the introductory courses and was particularly interested in community economic development. But as soon as I got out there, I was in desperate need of a job. And so because I was very clearly where I was absolutely on my own, moving away, and I found my first job. I was a teaching assistant in Native American Studies. They needed someone, and I was really interested in the position, and so I was hired in, and then just really fell in love with Native American Studies, the program out there. And there was a real tie-in to community development. There was a real overlap. There were a number of courses within Native Studies that could count toward the community development degree. And the further I went in the Masters of Community Development, I started taking classes in Native Studies as well. And then decided eventually, you know what, I love what I just love what I'm learning, and I'm going to begin working towards a PhD. That's how I started to move into Native Studies, Indigenous Studies, and that whole world.
So with the school journey, how long did it take?
It took a long time. I went out when I was about 22 and lived out in California there for about 5 years. And at that time, I finished my master's and then finished off the PhD courses there. And I moved out to Canada in 2006. I moved up to Regina, Saskatchewan to complete my dissertation and got a fellowship to come up here. But during that 5 years in California, I had started to work heavily with Native financial institutions. So that was a big focus in both my master's and my PhD, was looking at Native community development financial institutions, particularly in the master's program. And then I expanded to Native financial institutions in my PhD, and Aboriginal financial institutions, which is what drove me to Canada, right? For the PhD is to kind of look at kind of a comparative study of what's happening in Canada amongst Indigenous communities, peoples with regards to banking, financial institutions. And then I had an incredible experience working with Native financial institutions in the U.S. And actually my first job right out of college, for a very brief period, right? It was an internship right before I moved out to California for a community development financial institution in New York. And so that's kind of what initially made me aware of the work that those institutions were doing. And then when I got out to Davis, California, and got into that master's program, I started looking into Native community development financial institutions, because there were so many that it kind of were just being initiated at that time. So there's a few things to drill down on there. First of all, can you educate us just very, very basically on the proper terminology? Because I have heard that Native is okay in the States, but I know that it's not okay here. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Well, it's here, in Canada, I know that we use primarily Indigenous, right? When we're talking about, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. It's not something that is Native is not used in any kind of significant way that I'm aware of here in Canada, right? I never use it here very often, but it is used down in the States, and the program I was a part of was actually Native American Studies. So
it's still okay, because you're talking about the Native financial institutions, and that's how they would refer to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and more recently, I've started using Indigenous financial institutions generally, just to encompass both Native and Aboriginal financial institutions across Canada and the U.S. But in the States, Native CDFIs is how they were referred to. When I was doing my research and my dissertation, Native banks, right? Native banking.
Yeah. So just for people who are listening, so they can continue if they're having trouble with what we're saying. This obviously you have a PhD in Native American Studies. You're going to use the right terminology better than the rest of us. But then the second thing is, I don't know about Native financial institutions at all, and I guess that's maybe because I would never use them. Right.
They're very much being accessed primarily, certainly in the States and largely here. Although there are, I'm sure, some non-Indigenous people who might access certain banks, but Native. Well, there's First Nations Bank here and in Saskatoon, and I think that has a fairly wide audience, or clientele, I should say. And but primarily, you're absolutely right. Native financial institutions, Aboriginal financial institutions are very much there to serve First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, and so that is a core goal of these institutions.
So let's talk about the Canadian, just because I would probably be able to relate better. So could I open a bank account at First Nations Bank?
Yes, my understanding is absolutely you can.
And is it different than any other bank like in Canada? Like, is it under the does it have Canada Deposit Insurance, CDIC coverage, and that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does, and so that's an example of certainly of a bank that will, it offers checking, savings, different account options, right? Loans, lines of credit. It has obviously a specific target to work with First Nations communities, and so that's a primary goal. And they do a lot of targeted work with First Nations groups and providing access, right, to banking in communities, particularly some more remote communities throughout the country. So, but there's more specific. There's other types of institutions, Aboriginal financial institutions, such as the Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation, for example, that they're there to really just help support First Nations entrepreneurs.
I see. Oh, that's great.
They're doing developmental lending.
So they would be much more like I'm assuming all of these organizations are partly or entirely run by the First Nations community, or is that not correct?
So Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation is absolutely, it was one of the first Aboriginal financial institutions in Canada to offer developmental lending. And it was the history of that one in particular, right, is that it was created through the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations at the time. The FSIN is currently now the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, and they've created a number of First Nations organizations. First Nations University is one of the organizations that the FSIN created many years ago, and CEF is another one that they had a critical role in creating. And so there's the idea with Aboriginal financial institutions and certainly Native financial institutions in the States is that it's about Indigenous control and self-determination, right? Of finances and of their financial direction and future.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so mostly like any other bank in Canada, but any community initiatives, and then in the case of the fund, business loans or even maybe even grants, the ability to get funding for a business is fully towards the Indigenous communities.
Yes, exactly. The idea, I think, behind so many of these institutions, these Indigenous financial institutions, is to establish a source of lending, right, for community initiatives, for community economic development, and so, for example, that with CEF, right, when CEF was first began in '86, shortly before that, there was a need to establish a lending corporation, right, that was identified by the 74 First Nations of Saskatchewan that are a part of the FSIN. And these First Nations now make up the membership of CEF. And the whole idea was to create, that lending corporation to help provide for First Nations in Saskatchewan and their entrepreneurial ventures and economic development.
Is it fair to say that one of the main reasons is because it would be very hard to get funding from the regular banks at that time?
Absolutely. There was I think across North America, First Nations communities were denied access to much of the mainstream banking that was available to non-Indigenous peoples. So you really saw this movement of Indigenous financial institutions beginning in the 80s, really starting to move in the 90s and early 2000s. And so there's been a real growth really over the last 40 years, right? And these institutions are very much about, again, not just providing that access, but it's about, Indigenous control of Indigenous institutions, Indigenous self-determination.
I like that. I like that term, self-determination, because I mean, it's preceded by the worst kind of control and everybody else determining what they did with their lives, right?
Absolutely.
So to see this in a financial way is great because, of course, as we were talking about earlier, money and funding is what caused a lot of these conquests to be possible. Funding by governments of other countries and such, right? And when it came to coming in and taking over territories in North America. So that this is really great to hear. Honestly, I didn't know about First Nations University at all. Can you give us just a quick summary of the university and how it? You said it was started in the 80s or
late 70s, 1976, and so it began again through a vision. Right, of the elders at the time, of many of the kind of core elders that helped to create this university of the FSIN, and the idea was, again, Indigenous control of Indigenous education. That was kind of one of the driving forces at the time for many First Nations communities throughout North America, was how to create educational institutions that reflect the culture, values, and goals of Indigenous peoples, right? Especially coming out of the horrific era of residential schools and what that did to many communities. First Nations University was and it is an incredible light in this country. And
you knew about First Nations University when you were studying for your PhD. And was that a destination for you? Because you've been there for 12 years, right?
Yeah, I've been here since 2007 officially. Although I was doing some TAing here in 2006. I guess it was just early 2007. I started TAing, and then got my first job here in July of 2007. I was slightly aware before I came to Saskatchewan of First Nations University, but I hadn't known much about it until I knew I was going to be moving to Canada. I had been exposed to other Indigenous educational institutions. I had been working with a tribal college right outside of Davis, California. I was teaching an entrepreneurship course there at the time, and so I was really quite well aware of the incredible impact and role that tribal colleges and in the U.S. and Indigenous post-secondary institutions were having. And at the time I moved to Canada, I wasn't quite sure how long I was going to be staying. I came out, again, I had 9 months to work on my dissertation. But then I connected with a close colleague here, Dr. Bob Casius, who's been an incredible mentor and friend to me, and he had indicated, hey, there's an opening here, and I'd shared with him a lot of the work I was doing, and so luckily things fell into place, and I was able to start here, and it's been just the most incredible place to work. I'm grateful to be here.
Yeah. It just seems like such a great place, and the work that you're doing in financial literacy. Let's get back then to you now. So why did you come to Canada? Was it just for this? Was there another reason?
It was just to complete my dissertation at the time on Native and Aboriginal financial institutions. I was doing a comparative study, right? And I had applied for a Fulbright to come up here because I just was finding it very challenging to get any work done in Davis because I was working too many jobs as a research assistant and TA, and I could never find the time to do the work I had to do. So I said, I better see if I can find some support here to just focus on this. And luckily, it came through, and I moved here. I was doing some consulting work at the time as well with First Nations Owista Corporation, First Nations Development Institute, Opportunity Finance Network. These were all groups in the States that were doing incredible work with First Nations communities, particularly in terms of creating Native financial institutions, right? So these groups that I was consulting with, they were helping to support a lot of the First Nations communities who wanted to create their own financial institutions. And that was a big part of my research in my dissertation. I had done, a lot of work in the U.S. and wanted to go to Canada to see what the impact Aboriginal financial institutions were having, and so that's what took me to Regina.
Well, so what does it take to? Sorry, let's go back to you. I have so many questions because this is about your story as well. You're in Canada. But you have lots of debt.
Yeah.
that once you finally found your way, it seems like this is all very much worth it, right?
The
amount of debt that you went into, the history degree by itself, that's tough, and you're totally right in that. At that time, we were more focused on just go to school and figure it out, the payment later.
Yeah.
And I what I've been thinking about lately is that this is just a mentality passed on by our parents who, when school really didn't cost that much, you know?
Exactly.
Right? They didn't think about it. Yeah. Do you agree that that's what has happened? Like in our generation, we were like this middle generation where like, oh, of course you got to go to school, whatever, just do it. I did it. And then I got a job and it was easy.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just kind of the expectation, right? And at the time my folks went to school. It wasn't that much. For them, they walked away with very little debt, if any, really. And
and they had jobs lined up, probably, or easy enough to get them,
right?
So you're trapped in this thing where you went to school, but the good thing is you were able to sort of find your direction and then find this position. But how are you doing with keeping up with your personal finances at this point?
I had really no money except for, the Fulbright group. Fulbright Foundation was great. I had enough to get by on when I moved out here, right? I got a really cheap room. I lived with like 6 other people in a little house here when I first moved out. And for the first couple of years I lived here, and I just didn't have a lot, just started earning money, so I was so grateful. When I did get the job here at First Nations University, started putting money away, started paying off debt, right? Because at that point I had really had to defer a lot of my debt payment, right? Because I didn't have any significant income coming in grad school. I was just making enough money to get by, and so then I started paying off debt, and then, my dad brought up, because, again, he hadn't really talked with us about the debt that they had taken on, and I wasn't really clearly aware, right, of what that was. So it was not until, after, 2010, 11, sometime around there, he started to talk about, the debt he had taken on for me and my brothers. And so, and it created a lot of, I'll be honest, it created a lot of stress. I was a little frustrated. I said, why'd you wait so long to bring this up? We could have started tackling this maybe a little while ago if we had talked about it sooner. And so we worked through it, and now it's been, just trying to tackle that debt, and for my folks, I'm there's no way I'm going to let them take that on. They can't, they won't, they shouldn't, and they can't. And so I'm going, I'm working away at that and trying to kind of find a way to, get it done. And part of my challenge is, of course, I'm waiting for the exchange rate to sometimes peak, right? Because I have to pay this in US
additional
dollars.
Challenge. Yeah. That's I mean, some people have this issue, and it's not that common that you would be paying in another currency. You're getting paid in the lower value. Unfortunately, you're on the other side of it. It would maybe be easier. Actually, you wouldn't even have that much debt if it was a Canadian university.
Exactly.
So what is the policy at First Nations University? Like, just to contrast your situation where you're in debt working for this university, and now what is your current title?
Right now I am the Associate VP Academic at First Nations University of Canada, and I'm also an Associate Professor in business and public administration. So
you're teaching, but you're also doing a lot of admin work as well.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of admin work for sure. And so as I'm dealing with all this debt and trying to figure out a way to pay it off and move forward, I start looking into a class here that would be of benefit to students, right? So that they don't make the same mistakes maybe that I made in my life. And
so
actually,
you did something right away to try to implement your learnings.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
I had a good friend of mine, Grace McLeod, who used to be the director of student success services here, had said, she wanted to look at some type of course, right, that would help the students. Many of them she felt were needing a course in financial literacy, personal finance that would help them and guide them. And so I thought to myself, well, oh my gosh, not, much of the work I was doing in the past with Native financial institutions, with Indigenous financial institutions, there was a big focus on financial literacy within those institutions, right? There was a lot of, so many of the groups I was working with had very culturally relevant, tailored financial literacy curriculum. And so I thought to myself, and I had worked with the Nuo Yutina Friendship Center on a research project that they really had guided me on. Right, it was I had asked them what could we do here? What could I do to support you guys through the research project that was supported through the Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network, and I said, what would be something that would help support you? And they initially said, hey, we provided financial literacy courses to a number of our clientele, but it just didn't hit. It just didn't connect. And this was back in I think about 2012, 2013, when we embarked on this project. And I had said, well, I've done a lot of work with Indigenous financial institutions, particularly in the States. There was a lot of focus on financial literacy. They created their own curriculum. They had courses on financial literacy for the community. And so I was looking to a lot of what I had seen to First Nations Development Institute and Owista Corporation. And we started to look at AFOA, Aboriginal Financial Officers Association here too, and some of the curriculum they created to create something unique for the Friendship Center that would better connect with the clientele. And so it was through that research project, that work, that really community-driven research project, that I kind of had a base for this course, right? And because I had created workshop modules with the Friendship Center. And so when Grace, my friend, said, hey, we need a course here, we need something for our students, I said, well, you know what? I feel like I could do this. I feel like I have something that I could create a course from. And at the same time I created that course, there was an opportunity for funding for an open access textbook project. And I thought to myself, I want to find a textbook, a financial literacy textbook that the students could use in this course that would be free, right? So I want them to start saving money from the get-go, right? These textbooks are just a fortune and to be honest,
expensive.
They are, and students are not buying them a lot of the times, and they're not doing as well in classes because they won't buy the text. They'll just try to get by on PowerPoint slides or, copy, share with their friends, but they're not buying the textbooks. And so really, yeah, it's a big issue. That's why I'm such a big supporter of the open access.
Maybe the tuition is covered by loans or grants already, but they have to spend the money on the textbooks, or they can actually control whether they spend money on textbooks or not.
So a lot of students, if they have the funding, then the textbook issue maybe isn't as much of an issue. But for students who are putting themselves through on their own and working, the textbooks are just not they're a last option for them. They'll find any other route. I'll always put my textbooks on reserve for certain classes so that the students have access to them. And that's how I used to do it in university too. I used to try to avoid buying the texts a lot of the times if I could get them on reserve. But this open access textbook option allows, the idea is that textbooks are free. I'm
looking at it now. I love this, right? Like you can just go online and read the book.
Yeah.
Right. That's, it's that easy. Just click on the link, right?
Exactly.
And so you took this existing personal finance book, textbook, and you totally adapted it to be for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Like it's not like it excludes.
No.
It's not like it's only for Indigenous people. It just makes it actually for everyone.
Exactly. Because what I found is that when I was looking for texts for options for my students when I first wanted to create the course here back in 2017, there were no mention of First Nations people and Inuit, Métis, Indigenous peoples in general within any of the Canadian personal finance texts that I was looking at, right? And so I was bothered by that, and I certainly thought to myself, well, how are my students going to relate to this? So there's no mention of taxation on reserve. That's not reflected in any of the mainstream kind of resources I was looking at. There's just no mention of Indigenous peoples whatsoever from what I was, seeing at the time. And, a good friend of mine, Elsa Johnston, who helps to manage the open access program here at the U of R, the University of Regina, which is, First Nations University, is a federated college of the University of Regina. She had said, everyone needs to be able to see themselves in what they're learning, right?
Yes. I love that concept, and it applies to everything, I think. We need representation in everything so that you can be reflected in what you see.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So this text was an effort to, make this topic far more accessible and relevant and interesting to, to my students, to, Indigenous students across the country, to communities, Indigenous communities and peoples, and also certainly to a Canadian audience, right? So because this was a U.S.-based open access text that I adapted, and so I had to take all of the U.S. content out and really focus completely on Canada and Indigenous and Indigenous people here within Canada.
That's amazing, and of course the PhD and experience is how you were able to do this. It's almost time for me to let you go. It went by really fast, actually.
It did, yeah.
But I do want to hear your impression of the state of financial literacy. I guess let's stick with Canada, just to make it simple. But if you have American examples as well too, that's great. But what's the state of financial literacy in Indigenous communities today?
Well, I think it's very promising, right? There's a lot more access to resources that I believe do reflect the values and histories of Indigenous peoples. And so AFOA Canada, for example, they're doing some really great work. AFOA, the BC chapter, has done some really great work on the creation of financial literacy curriculum, that's available to Indigenous peoples, and so there's more and more coming out that I think that does make this topic more relevant, more accessible. I think that there's a lot more to do, though. There's a lot more that we can be doing. One of the key differences I've noticed just between many of the Native financial institutions in the States and the Aboriginal financial institutions here in Canada is that there was a lot more funding, at least when I was doing my dissertation at that time, for financial literacy through Native financial institutions in the U.S. than there is necessarily here today in Canada for Aboriginal financial institutions. That pot of money was quite significant, and I think allowed for many financial institutions in the States, Native financial institutions, to create culturally tailored curriculum and really, be able to deliver that in a really accessible way. So I think that I'd like to see more resources that can be used to broaden the reach and to create more access when it comes to this topic in Indigenous communities. And so it's exciting to have been given this opportunity to adapt this textbook. And I'm working, with the FCAC right now. And that work is, I'm hoping, going to allow for this topic of financial literacy within Indigenous communities to have a broader reach.
Yes, and the FCAC is a good place to do that. So we're taking this out of isolation, and it feels odd to say it, but we need to reintegrate the way that we present. Like we let's bring First Nations community back into the discussion, right? Because the banks don't seem to be aware. This is what I see. The banks don't seem to be aware that the First Nations exist. The big banks.
There's a lot more happening today than certainly in the past. And, TD was a big supporter of the creation of First Nations Bank, and in its early years, RBC has been doing some really great work with Indigenous communities here in Canada. So there's I think more and more efforts being made that I'm absolutely seeing today. So I will say that the bigger banks are getting more involved and helping to move this forward. I know that many of the credit unions as well. Connexus Credit Union was a big supporter of the financial empowerment class here, and helped to really contributed a lot to that course and getting it off the ground. So I think there's a real desire and effort being made by many of these banks and mainstream banks, credit unions to help move this topic of financial literacy forward and provide more access to lending. But I still feel like there's a lot more that we could be doing, and certainly I think the importance of providing resources within Indigenous communities and having Indigenous communities drive this, right, is critical.
Yeah, I mean the banks have the money. I'm looking at the BMO front page right now, and it's got 4 white people on it. Mm-hmm. And like that, mm-hmm. It's not. I don't need to see myself reflected. I don't have that need. It's always been that way for me, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's not important to me. It's important to others, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm looking at the First Nations Bank Canada, and of course, it's all First Nations, mm-hmm. as it should be. But why are we still presenting this white face on everything Canadian when we're so diverse, right? Like not just the people who were here before we came, but everybody who came after too, who is not a white person.
Yeah.
Right. Like
absolutely.
It just seems like we're. I like that you're saying that it is promising, and I know there's lots of work to do. I feel like it's the financial, and tell me if you disagree, but I feel like overall, especially Canadian financial advertising and just the presentation of your retirement can look like this and all that kind of stuff. It's all very whitewashed. No?
Yeah, no, I agree. I absolutely agree.
And full of privilege. Too.
Exactly.
So what, like, just the things that you just said that we can do, we can just keep the conversation going. Is that the what we can do right now? What can everybody do? What can anyone do?
Yeah, and that's the great question. I think that it has to go beyond keeping the conversation going, and what the answer is, I don't know, but I do know that we have to look at financial literacy and how it's been framed, and we need to be able to change that. Change it in such a way that it's something that people want to embrace, and particularly, of course, I'm talking about Indigenous communities. Change the way we talk about financial literacy, personal finance, and so, for example, I talk about in the text, I talk about the rich economic history of Indigenous communities and peoples here in Canada, and how they demonstrated strong personal financial skills pre-contact. Absolutely,
and really, that's amazing.
Well, and I really have, again, First Nations Owista Corporation and First Nations Development Institute to thank on that, because that's really something that they focused on in a lot of their financial literacy curriculum. They're building Native communities curriculum. They highlight that history, traditional resource management, and how that ties into today and personal finance. So how do we take traditional resource management and the lessons that it teaches and apply it to managing our finances today, right? And so it's about connecting Indigenous histories, values, and that rich economic history that I'm talking about to today.
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic way to, especially if it's Indigenous youth who are feeling like, I can't be part of this, financial system. By going back, the interviews with the elders that you have in the book, is that what they're talking about?
Much of what they talk about is their experience and how they survived given the colonial legislation and structures that were in place, given racially focused forms of social and economic exclusion that they had to, undergo, and such as reserves, residential schools, the pass system, right? These all are just examples of that social and economic exclusion, and how it limited them from fully participating and engaging in the economy, right? The mainstream economy. And I have one elder I interviewed, Elder Rose Bird, from Thunderchild First Nation. She's one of our elders here at First Nations University up in Prince Albert. She explained how that colonial legislation and structures that were in place, how it controlled, she felt controlled, and that they were in place to control Indigenous people and create a system of dependency that really denied many access to money and an education in money management, and how to, not being able to actually control their own finances in many cases on reserve, right? Having to go through the Indian agent to access food and to be able to even go off reserve, right? When the pass system was in place, there was a complete dependency and lack of access to money and controlling their own financial state.
No, that's why, like, when you said, self-determination and these, Indigenous banks run by Indigenous people, it's, that's probably the best thing that I've heard about this, because even if, like, let's say a business could get a loan from BMO or whatever, it's still they wouldn't feel like they had control, right? And it's not necessarily because that is the case. It's because that's how it always was, and we can't expect the adjustment to be that fast, right? It's going to take some time, but I hope that this continues, and that anybody can find a place to bank or get money, or to learn about to have financial education or literacy where they feel comfortable. And so it seems like you have so many awesome resources. What's the best way for someone to go and read the financial empowerment book? I'll put the link in the show notes, but, like, can they go to the university website and search for you, or what's the best place?
If they can go through the University of Regina site, and they can certainly just plug in financial empowerment, personal finance for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I think that if you go to Google as well and just plug that in, you might just be right up there, right? Mm-hmm. That's great. So you're teaching, and can anyone go to First Nations University I see that you can learn about First Nations. It's not just First Nations people going, you're learning. There's so many courses. Yeah, absolutely. First Nations University is open to all, and we have we're in an exciting place. We're growing in some significant ways. We are teaching a growing number of Indigenous students all the time here. We've been on an upward trajectory for quite some time, and we're doing a lot of work in educating non-Indigenous people as well. So we have certainly I think an incredible role to play here in Canada, and I encourage people to check out the university website, fnuniv.ca, www.fnuniv.ca, and we have a number of different programs that we offer here, and financial empowerment is one of them in the business program. So that's perfect. Like, I love the concept that First Nations University exists in general, and then the fact that you're able to do this whole financial literacy thing along. It just I'm so glad you're able to come on the show and talk about this. You're playing a really important role. So,
Keep going. Another 12 more years.
Well, I'm so grateful for the opportunity, and thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this last hour. It did go quick.
That's right. All right. Well, thanks so much, and I will speak to you again in the future. We'll keep this conversation going.
I would love that. Thank you.
And that was episode 95 with Bettina Schneider. If you like the podcast and want to see me get to episode 100 and beyond, please support the podcast by going to my Patreon site and becoming a patron. It's only a few bucks a week, but if enough people do it, it starts to add up. Head over to patreon.com/BoHumphreys if you're interested. That's it for this episode. I'll be back next week with personal finance expert and the author of the best-selling Broke Millennial book series, Erin Lowry.